So that process that has just taken place is called polymorphism. It adapted to the environment that it was given. We have many different values in this array, and the PHP compiler will do its best to try and coerce the data, but there are limits and you may get errors, but that's good because it provides structure to our application and gives us the intended data type for our argument. So how do we coerce all of these parameters to be of the same data type? Well, when we declare the argument, what we need to do is we need to define the coercion. So this is the data type that we want to say to the compiler, look, try your best to coerce these values to this data type. And that could be, let's say, int. So I'm going to try and coerce all of these values to be of the same data type. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, and let's refresh in the browser. So now you'll notice that we have the first element, that didn't need to be changed, that was an integer. The second element was a string, and you'll now notice it doesn't have quotes around it, it just simply stripped the quotation marks around it and it produced an integer. And then also we have the floating point number 22.22, and what it did was it stripped the decimal place away, so we got 22, and true was converted into the number 1, and if we typed in false, that would convert to 0. Now if we, let's say, had the string right here, if that had a decimal place in there, that decimal place would be stripped away. I hit refresh. You'll notice nothing changed, but what it did was it took that string, it took it out of the string, and then it simply stripped away the decimal place, so it just left us with the whole numbers. Now do be careful, there are limits to what PHP can do. For example, if this string contained a special character such as the dollar or pound symbol, then you will get a fatal error. And then also if you had, let's say, a formatted number like this with a comma in there, then if I was to save this and hit refresh, you'll notice that it said, well, it wasn't a very well formatted numeric string. So it only returned just to this point where the comma resides, and then it stripped away all the rest of it. So you do have to be careful right there. Now, if I wanted to keep the decimal places, then what I'd need to do is coerce the data to a float. Now, the float data type will allow integers, no problem, but it will also allow the decimal places as well. So if I hit refresh, there we go, we have the number 20, 200.44, 22.22, and 0 for false. So we just kept those decimal places and we coerced the Boolean and the string to be of the float data type. So it does have some polymorphism, but we know that there are limits to what we can do. Now, on top of that, we can also coerce the data to be of the Boolean data type by typing in bool. Please don't type in Boolean, just type in bool. And then I can hit refresh. So what's going to happen is if the number or string or whatever it is has a value, then it's going to be true. However, if it's, let's say, false, well, that doesn't need any coercion. That's already of the Boolean data type. But if it's 0, and only if it's 0, will you get false. So 0, the numerical 0, will be converted into false. Let's take a look at the string right here. If I was to say 0 in the string, would that work? The answer is yes. So what it did was it took that string, it converted it into an integer, and then it said 1 or 0, and it just said false. So that's fine. And also, let's make it an empty string. Let's see about that. Again, an empty string will coerce to false. So have a play and really try to change these values, because it's always worth having a bit of a play with these. Now, on top of that, we also have the other primitive coercion data type, so primitive being either a string, an integer, a floating point, or a Boolean. They're your 4 main primitive type coercions. And we can now say string. So it's actually very, very easy to coerce all your data types into strings, and you pretty much won't get an error when you do that. If I was to hit refresh, you'd notice that we have everything now in quotation marks because everything is a string. And if it's false, it's going to be an empty string. And let's go ahead and set that to true and just see what we get back. So if I say true, you'll notice that it produces a 1 within the string. And if we open up our script again, what we have here is general coercion. So all of the parameters, all of the values that are going to be passed into the array that's stored within this argument right here need to be of this data type. So you can do that sort of general coercion if you'd like, but also you can define your arguments and coercion individually. For example, I could say, right, I'm going to have an int argument, and we want to force the parameter, the value that goes into this argument, to be of the data type int. Likewise, I could have another argument called string, and I could coerce it to be of the string data type, and so on and so forth. So you have int, string, float, and bool. These are the coercion types for primitive data. So if you think about primitive data, just think, caveman, back to primitive times. They're the simplest form of data. They're not like arrays or objects where they contain many pieces of information. No, they're just like a number or a string on its own, or a floating point number, or a true or false value on its own. They are primitive. They are very, very simple forms of data. But they're not the only types of coercion that you can apply. So in the next lecture, what we're going to do is take a look at other types of coercion for a bit more complex data. But these are your primitive data type coercions, and you will be using these a lot, I'm sure, throughout your programming.